The following program is brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org. That's novusordowatch.org.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Trad Controversies on the Restoration Radio Network. I'm your host, James Schrupper, and on this episode, I'm joined by our regular guest, Father Anthony Cekada from St. Gertrude the Great Church in Westchester, Ohio. Father, it's so good for you to join us again tonight.
It's always a pleasure to be here, and some people would tell you Father Cekada can't resist a good controversy.
Father, you seem to live in controversy.
I think that's one of the problems of our age, I'm afraid.
Now, on this episode tonight, we're going to be discussing the Sovereign Military Order of St. John of Jerusalem, also simply known as the OSJ. And the title of this episode is In the Shadows Behind the Mask of the OSJ. So, Father, just to begin with, when I was looking at any scholarly paper, I flipped to your footnotes first. This is based off an article written for the Roman Catholic in 1981, I believe, so 30-some years ago already. And I noticed you had 132 footnotes, almost more footnotes than you did typing for the article.
Well, it was quite a story, and it was necessary to do an awful lot of research for an article on the OSJ because of the different claims that it had made. Very broad and very astounding claims, actually. To give you a little background about what prompted me to look into this issue, the underlying question is one that's come up in these shows on Catholic controversies before, and that's come up in articles that we've discussed on our website and films and Restoration Radio broadcasts. The question of jurisdiction and how, in the face of the disaster that followed from the Second Vatican Council, Catholics who wanted to preserve the faith were supposed to proceed. So this was quite an issue, really, from the beginning in the 1960s. There were, in different parts of the United States, priests who realized that there was something wrong with the Vatican II changes, particularly with the liturgical changes, the new Mass of Paul VI in 1969. They regarded it as a rite that was Protestant and that was modernist. And these priests were approached by members of the laity to say Mass for them. Father, can you come and say Mass for me? We are upset with the changes in the church. We would still like a good priest like yourself to come and say the old Mass. So in the 60s and 70s, the priests who were doing this, who were resisting the changes, were raised, obviously, in the old schools, studied in the old seminaries, and they had the idea drummed into them, the very good idea, that the Church, Catholic Church, operates according to certain laws, and that a good priest follows the laws of the Church, and that he conducts his ministry in accordance with these different laws. The one point always, especially for diocesan priests, was the question of your promise of obedience and your submission to the diocesan bishop. That you signed an oath and a promise to that effect, and in the ordination ceremony, you made a promise of obedience to him, and you put your hands inside his hands, and he said, "Will you promise me and my successor's obedience and reverence?" And you said, "Promitto, I do." So these older priests were very conscious of the law of the church. So they had that on one side. On the other side, they had this revolutionary change that they knew was not Catholic. So they wanted to find a way to reconcile the ministry they wanted to perform, which was to preserve the traditional Mass and to preserve traditional Catholic teaching, reconcile that with the idea of the law of the Church and authority and jurisdiction. So you had, from the beginning, different people coming up, different priests coming up with different theories about how best to do this. And admittedly, it was a confusing time because Vatican II produced this cataclysmic event in the church. One of the solutions to this question of jurisdiction that people at the beginning of the traditionalist movement in the United States saw as a viable way of taking care of this jurisdiction question was the organization that we're going to talk about tonight. The OSJ, the Knights of St. John, they also call themselves the Sovereign Order of St. John of Jerusalem, or the Knights of Malta. In the beginning in the traditional movement, this group was rather visible, and some of the priests who would offer Mass under the auspices of this group would advertise themselves as belonging to it. The proto-trad publisher in the United States was Tom Nelson of 10 Books in Rockford, Illinois, and Tom was a member of this organization. One of the proto-trad priests in the United States, another one, was Father James Wathen. And Father Wathen wrote the first book in English that was a critique of the New Mass, and that was called The Great Sacrilege, and really a great title. And Tom Nelson at 10 published it. And so you had this organization, the Knights of Malta, the OSJ, sponsoring Masses in different parts of the United States. And some priests saw this as an answer to their prayers as regard the question of jurisdiction. They could say that I belong to this order which has certain privileges, and therefore I don't have to listen to the diocesan bishop who says that you, Father X, you have to stop saying Mass. In fact, one of the, in addition to Father James Wathen, perhaps the proto-trad of proto-trad priests in the United States, was Father Gomer de Paul. I remember him objecting to the changes in 1964 when I was in 8th grade. And he actually joined this organization for a while. So that gives you a little bit of the context of why this organization became somewhat prominent in the traditionalist movement, and also why it was it attracted my attention and it attracted my interest.
So, Father, if I'm understanding this correctly, these priests turned to this order, which would be a Catholic order similar to the Franciscans or the Dominicans, to receive their jurisdiction from that order rather than their local diocesan bishop?
That was the idea. That was the idea that the OSJ sold them on. That if you join this particular order, you don't have to worry about your diocesan bishop anymore. He doesn't have any jurisdiction over you. We, the officials of this order, have jurisdiction over you now. So you have nothing to worry about.
Did you have any personal experience with either Father Wathen, Father Gomer de Paul, or Tom Nelson, or other clergy that were members of the OSJ, or did you have any individuals that were going to this order?
I didn't meet a cast of characters until a little bit later on. Only much later did I meet Father Wathen, but of course I had read his book. I had heard about him, and I had seen the OSJ advertised in different traditionalist publications, and I had seen their masses advertised. They would refer to their chapels as the priory, which is a name that's used normally for a religious house. So I would come across this actually quite a bit, and at a certain point as well, you started to read in traditionalist publications like the Remnant and Patrick Henry Omler's publication Interdum, articles questioning the different aspects and different claims that were made by this organization. So that was my exposure to it, and I had as a priest, I was first in Armada, Michigan, in 1977 and 1978. In 79, I moved to Oyster Bay. There's no activity by the OSJ in Michigan, but on Long Island. From Long Island, I went to a number of places in different parts of the country where there were mass centers that were affiliated in one way or another with the OSJ.
So once these questions about the OSJ started to surface from different people, obviously the internet really wasn't invented or readily available, so you couldn't just type it into Google. So
Al Gore had not invented the internet yet, so
there we go.
We would still have to wait for that.
So, Father, when you got questions like this on a topic back 30-some years ago, what did you have to do to find source material to reference to answer these questions that were coming up?
Well, as I've mentioned this before, it involved trips to libraries, and libraries
what are those, Father? I'm from the generation. You probably have to explain it. I think I got a faint memory.
They have this collection of bits of dead trees with little markings on them. So you would
there you go. That's why Al Gore invited the internet, because he was to save these trees to stop global warming. So
yes,
now we have
that's right. So it comes full circle, right? So what you would have to do is physically you would drag yourself over to a library, and then to research anything, boys and girls, if you are listening, you would go to something that was called a card catalog that had index cards in it with typing on them, and these books, these listed the books, and there was one collection of cards in every library that was by author, another by book title, and another by topic. And so you would have to often have some sort of an idea of the title of a book in order to find information on a particular topic. And if it did not exist in that library, well, then you'd have to go to another library to find out about it. So it was quite an adventure. And the difficulty in those days in obtaining information was you never knew what you would find in a library if it had anything on the particular topic that you were discussing, or if it had a book that you wanted, you would have to call a library or physically go over to visit it. So the difficulty was, while you certainly could research more general topics, let us say in canon law and in church history, in Catholic university and seminary libraries, it was very difficult to find information on on what was essentially an obscure topic, such as the question of this Order of St. John. This traditionalist organization in the United States. They made these fantastic claims about their legal rights and how they had been they were patronized by the czars of Russia, and there were all these papal bulls that were backing up their legitimacy, and they had gotten this approval and that approval, and this document proved their existence, and that document. So these were all relatively obscure topics. So to get to the bottom of this question, I had to go to a whole load of libraries in the Middle West and on the East Coast to find out information about the history of this organization and to verify its claims. I hit the jackpot at Catholic University in Washington. I'm not sure exactly how I got put onto the Catholic University for their section on the Knights of Malta, but I went down there and I spent some time at the Catholic University Library, and it turned out that up in the attic, in a very dusty part of one of the buildings, they had several ranks of bookshelves that were dedicated exclusively to books about the Knights of Malta. By the Knights of Malta, I mean the organization that was officially recognized as a religious order by the Catholic Church during the Crusades. So there were many, many very interesting books that dealt with the history of the order in general, and that also discussed two specific issues that I wanted to find out more about. One was the history of the Order of St. John, recognized by the Catholic Church, the one that was recognized by the Catholic Church in Russia. Because one of the claims of this American organization was that somehow they derived their legitimacy as a part of the Knights of Malta through Russia. So this was a somewhat obscure topic, but it turned out that the Catholic University had quite a bit on that. The other issue that interested me is I wanted to find out what exactly the order that was recognized by the Catholic Church had to say about these other groups that also claimed to be the Knights of Malta. I had discovered that there was not only this American group headquartered in Pennsylvania that claimed to be the legitimate Knights of Malta, but that there were other entities scattered throughout the United States that claimed to be Knights of Malta as well. So apparently this was a fairly common claim for certain types of fraternal organizations, and often there was a Masonic connection in one way or another, because of course the 19th century in the United States was the great age of where Masonry really flourished, and a number of these outfits claimed to have connections with the Knights of Malta, especially the Knights of Malta in Jerusalem. So in any event, I spent a couple of days slogging through the information in the Catholic University and taking notes. Photocopying material was, of course, technically much more difficult in those days as well. It was difficult to get good photocopies of material that you wanted. I was put on to the names of some books that I actually was able to order, so I could have full copies of my own. Some of the material I was able to borrow. So I got quite a bit of information from Catholic University, and in fact, I thought it was a pity that the collection really was in such an obscure place in the library, so I actually at some point wrote to the American commander of the legitimate order of the Knights of Malta, a businessman in New York City named William Grace, and pointed this out to him and got a very nice letter back from him saying that it certainly would be something that the Knights would try to fix. So I went from Washington then to Pennsylvania, and I believe it was in Scranton, Pennsylvania, to the federal court there. And I had heard that the Knights of the American Knights of Malta were having some sort of a dispute and battling back and forth, and I was sure that I could find much in the way of interesting material there in the court records in federal court in Pennsylvania. And the someone in the court who was very helpful and actually managed to get me copies of certain documents that were essential. So I, having done this research and traveling around there and to other libraries, then I eventually sat down to write this article and to put all the material together.
So, Father, you didn't just make stuff out of thin air. You actually spent months digging into source material, researching, trying to find books. And I noticed in even some of the footnotes, you were able to find some of the original letters from some of the czars, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So it sounded like you got quite a bit of material over the course of your journey to go on.
Well, you see, you had to, because there were so many questions about this American organization, so many claims that they had made. It was a bit of detective work trying to figure out everything. Because, they claim to be a sovereign state. They claim to have this extraterritorial jurisdiction. They claim that they were the real order, that the order in Rome was not the legitimate order, and so on. So there were all these different claims that you had to deal with, these claims that you had to answer.
And so for the listener, just so they understand, there is still a legitimate organization of the Knights of Malta that is recognized by the Vatican II Church even. And then there are these spin-off groups that all claim to have their lineage to a branch from Russia. So there's two different branches we're looking at today. And before we discuss each one of those branches, now that we've given the listener a background of the material that you got to research this topic, why don't, Father, if you could give us a little history of the order before the Russian controversy, and how did it start, what was its purpose, to give the listener some background to this order.
Okay, so everyone is familiar with the Crusades and is familiar with what a key part that is in the history of the Church. During the time of the Crusades, of course, there was battles between the Christians and the Muslims for the Holy Land, and the Christians established themselves in the Holy Land, and then many Christian pilgrims from throughout the West came to visit Jerusalem. So the Order of Malta, the one that we're talking about, originally was called the Hospitallers of St. John of Jerusalem. They took care of pilgrims who came to Jerusalem. And since the times were incredibly dangerous, this organization actually became a military religious order. That strikes us as somewhat surprising, but it was necessary, and especially in such a hostile environment. So the members of this order bound themselves by the standard vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Their apostolate was to take care of Christians who are going to the Holy Land, but also they had military training, and some served as knights in effect, who defended the holy place and who would defend pilgrims. The order was approved by the popes. There were a number of other orders like this. It was recognized as religious orders are as exempt from certain duties to the local diocesan bishop. Their headquarters was in Rome, and so on. The Muslims eventually reconquered Jerusalem. So the order had to pick up its roots there, and they moved to the island of Rhodes in the Mediterranean, and they were very good at adapting themselves to different circumstances. They put aside the idea of battling on land, and then started battling on ships, and turned into sort of a naval military order. It became quite internationalized. Christians from all over the world came to join it. It was divided into different groups that were called tongues, that is to say, language groups. It acquired property and had a way of electing those who would run the order. It was considered an order of, as well, to achieve a certain rank in the order, you had to have a title of nobility. You had to come from a noble family. Now that strikes us in our own age as the antithesis of what one would expect in the church. But remember this, that it was a fact of society that people who came from the upper ranks of society, from the nobility, had certain obligations to society in general. So, part of this was the work in the way of the defense of Christian society as knights and as those who would run society. So it was natural that in an order like the Knights of St. John, that the heads would be members of the nobility. Well, sooner or later, the Turks eventually in the 16th century managed to expel the order from the island of Rhodes as well. So they ended up in the island of Malta, and they were given that by Charles V, and so they became known as the Knights of Malta. And they continued their military vocation. They fought against the awful Barbary pirates and tried to defeat the pirates from the coast of North Africa. They tried to rescue Christian galley slaves, and so on. They founded priories and religious establishments in Europe. There, in fact, is even there's even one of them in London, in the city of London. There's a church of the Knights of Malta. Eventually, their fortunes started to wane because of the different changes in society, and finally they were done in, as so many institutions were by a combination of the Protestant revolt and then eventually by Napoleon. So that kind of brings them up to the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century. But it was a glorious organization. It continues to exist. It has it's still recognized internationally as a sovereign state. Their headquarters is up on one of the hills of Rome, near the Benedictine residence, and next to a very famous Dominican church, Santa Sabina, and there's a very famous tourist point in the tourist visit to that part of Rome, where you look through the keyhole in the Priory of the Knights of Malta, and you get a very beautiful picture, a very beautiful view of St. Peter's, St. Peter's in Rome. So they continue to exist, and now they do charitable activities, take care of pilgrims, and contribute to different war-torn parts of the world, try to help people out. And people still are members of the Knights of Malta, and it is considered among Catholic laymen who are involved in various charities a great honor to be appointed an honorary member of the Knights of Malta.
And Father, just a little background for the listeners, some of the terms that are used to designate the different positions in the order. Their superior of the order was called a Grand Master. Then there were different members that were in charge of different regions, and they were called bailiffs, I believe,
bailiffs.
From your article. And the last topic that I think is one of controversy is this designation of what did it mean to be a protector of the order?
Well, you have to step back a little bit, and religious orders in the Catholic Church have a superior general, or in this case, a Grand Master, who's the administrative head of the order. He is the actual religious superior of those monks or those religious who are members of a religious order. In addition to that, the most orders in the church have what is called a protector. So it can be it's generally a person in some sort of a high ecclesiastical position, or occasionally in a high civil position as well, who takes an interest in the work of the order and tries to promote it and tries to promote its interests. So, for instance, I was a member of the Cistercian order, and we had a cardinal protector, and he had ties to our order. He was interested in its spirituality and its work, and in different cases or issues that might come up at the Vatican, he would promote the position of the order. So yes?
And a protector isn't a member of the order. They're just a beneficiary of the order, correct?
A benefactor of the order, yes. And so the cardinal who was the cardinal protector of the Cistercian order was not actually a member of the order, but it was a title as well that could be, an honorary title, that you would ask someone to be your protector. And sometimes it was done in the days of kings and emperors. Sometimes the emperor was asked to be the protector of your order as well. So if you had connections with Franz Joseph Habsburg in Austria, you might ask him to be the protector of your order as well, and he would promote the interests of your order and, perhaps contribute generously to your order's fundraising campaigns.
Okay. So we talked about the order up basically to the turn of the 18th century. You have the Protestant Revolution, obviously with heads rolling in France in the 1790s. Nobility was declining. So that gets us to this point of controversy here, or this time of controversy in Russia, which started around 1788, 1789. And what was this, or what is this point of contention in Russia in regards to the order?
Well, the point of contention as far as the story of the American group is basically this, that due to different political circumstances in Europe at that time, Paul, the Tsar of Russia, Paul I, who of course was an Orthodox schismatic, he ended up as a becoming the protector of the order and becoming involved in the affairs of the order. And the order had lost its power over Malta and was being undergoing difficulties in just about every country in the world. So Paul I took an interest in the order's affairs and managed to get himself involved as a protector of the order, despite his status as an Orthodox schismatic. But since he actually wasn't a member, from a canonical point of view, something like that was not really all that strange. So he got involved. He also was a character. Some people said that he was a few sandwiches short of picnic, as they would say in New York, and a little bit delusional. He very much loved fancy ceremonies and fancy titles and fancy uniforms, and of course, being involved with the Order of Malta as a protector, he got to wear all of this very interesting gear. So in any event, the dispute or the issue initially was over the question of Polish priory. This was transferred to the Tsar's capital at St. Petersburg, and he was very, very generous to this priory. And he promised to leave the Catholic Knights alone, to let them observe their own traditions and their customs and their regulations. So he had a hands-off policy initially, which is why it was acceptable. He was invested as a protector of the Order of Malta, and then we get into the politics of these different issues in 1789, and division among the members of the order, and a great deal of confusion because of a turbulent political atmosphere in Europe at the time. So there was a dispute over the suitability of the Grand Master of the order, a man named von Hompesch, and whether or not he was doing what he's supposed to do. Pius VI got involved. There are further internal divisions in the order. And then the Russian Knights decided that, well, to protect themselves, they would elect Paul I as the Grand Master of the order, which was something that was impossible in terms of canon law, because he wasn't a member of the Catholic Church. So
he was Orthodox schismatic, correct?
That's correct. He is an Orthodox schismatic, and so there were more disputes between the St. Petersburg Priory and priories elsewhere, the Pope again got involved and said that the previous Grand Master had been irregularly deposed. This was invalid, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it is at this point, with the involvement of Paul the First, the schismatic czar, as the Grand Master of the Order of Malta, that we get into the connection that eventually leads to this American group in the United States. What happened is after the Tsar died, basically what happened is that all of the knights of the order swore their obedience to the new Grand Master. The popes intervened throughout the 19th century and mentioned the status of the Russian czars as something of only as protectors, a purely honorary title, and took command of took the affairs of the order into their hands, and established this priory for their headquarters then on this hill in Rome, and so it continued to the time of the Second Vatican Council, and indeed it continues today.
And in this action of the popes recognizing that von Hompesch was still a legitimate Grand Master, that was subsequently recognized by the next Tsar after the death of Paul I. I think his name was Alexander I. He recognized that Paul I was an illegitimate claimant to the Grand Master of the order as well, I believe.
Yes, and his position was that, well, this is something that we as Tsar are no longer going to be involved in, to the extent that Paul I was. So that pretty much was the end of it as regards the canonical issue in Russia, because the Russian government in effect conceded that, well, it was the order recognized by the Pope was the legitimate order.
In Russia, they went so far as to actually take away the properties and pretty much completely suppress the order, didn't they?
Yes, indeed. And so those properties were returned to the imperial crown, and so it underwent, in effect, a civil suppression by the civil government. So that would obviously would argue against any continued existence of this organization of Malta in Russia. And remember, it's through Russia that this was all that this American group made its claims and claimed to derive its history.
So, how did the American organization get started then?
Well, this, of course, is the great mystery. Like, what exactly is the connection to Russia? And the answer that I came up with is that I really could not find any connection. This was not only based on my own research, but actually there was a lengthy study that was done by some scholars in the order itself, the members of the Rome-based Order of Malta, who went through all of the documents on Russia and analyzed them all in a very complete study, and said that there is simply no documentation to support the continued existence of an Order of Malta in Russia. And the cherry on top, they said, is that an official publication put out by the Tsar in St. Petersburg in 1891, makes this absolutely clear, that it simply did not exist. However, if you can't find the connection there, nevertheless, you do find different claims by the American group that the order was somehow refounded or continued in the United States. So you find in 1890 some claims that that a man named William Lamb, who is a former colonel of the Confederate Army, was elected the Grand Prior of the Knights of Malta in the United States. But the documentation for this is again very sketchy, and you have all of these fantastic claims that to a continuity that really can't be proved. So when you look up, say, the history of this Colonel Lamb and what he did, etc., you find no reference to a connection with some sort of American priory of the Knights of Malta. So one question leads to another. And then you find Protestant organizations in the United States claiming to be the Knights of Malta, but again, the connection between this and Russia and the legitimate Order of Malta is something that is not documented, cannot be proved.
And the supporters of the American OSJ, this new branch that has popped out of, I guess, a cave, they claim, I believe, that Paul I, the Tsar Paul I, who we discussed before, was an illegitimate ruler of the order there in Russia anyway, that he supposedly set up what they call hereditary commanders, and somehow Colonel Lamb would be because of his lineage, would automatically assume the position as commander of the order, whatever that exactly means.
Yes, and the difficulty is that no one has ever been able to prove a connection between Lamb and this Russian this organization that supposedly existed in Russia. I mean, the guy was the Confederate colonel and the mayor of Norfolk, and Lamb is not exactly an old Russian name. So that's if it had been Lamanov or something like that, it might get our attention. But you can find there's absolutely nothing to support this, and I did a fair amount of research in who's and newspapers, etc. Managed to get the old microfilms of the New York Times that talked about Lamb, but you can never find this connection between him and Russia.
And in any order in the Catholic Church, is there any such thing as becoming a hereditary member?
Well, one hope not, because you're supposed to take a vow of chastity. So the idea that you inherit a membership in a religious order through your family is a canonical absurdity. No one would make that claim, and certainly in the historical Knights of Malta, the real group that was approved by the Catholic Church, nothing like that existed.
And for membership in any order, is it not true that the individual person themselves have to willingly enter the order if you're somehow genetically automatically enrolled? That kind of removes free will.
To say the least. To say the least, because a religious order is supposed to present an opportunity to practice the different virtues to their perfection, and that isn't something that's a commitment that you make over and above your the commitment of that you made as a Christian at your baptism. So that's something that you freely accept, and there are that's all governed by the rules and canonical legislation of the church. You have to make a novitiate. You have to spend a certain time there in religious formation, then eventually make vows, and then it has to be clear that these vows are freely made. So you can't really speak of hereditary membership in a religious order. It's against the nature of it. The most that you could say is that, well, and this was a regulation at a certain point in the history of the Knights of Malta, that in order to enter the novitiate of the order and in order to become a higher member of the order, you had to have a noble background. And you had to have so much nobility, a certain amount of nobility in your background in order to advance in the order. But simply inheriting membership in the religious order, that did not work. That's against the mind of the church.
To move on a little bit, or just to finish this point, actually, Paul I, from your research, didn't even create this concept of hereditary commanders. He created something similar to like rights of patronage, like hereditary benefactors, which has nothing to do with actually being an actual member.
Yeah, there's another. This is another concept in, I don't know about the Eastern schismatics, but in canon law in the West, there was what was called a jus patronatus, that for the appointment to a certain to say certain positions in the church, sometimes a nobleman or a noble family would have the right to appoint, to propose someone for a particular ecclesiastical post. So if you had if we were living in the Middle Ages, let us say, and we're in the dukedom of Westchester, Ohio, okay, and the let's say the Duke of the area, let's call him the Duke of Energy because Duke Energy is big around here, that he has the right to appoint the pastor of the parish, to propose the name of, say, the pastor of a parish on Rialto Road in Westchester. So that would be the jus patronatus, and he could propose someone to become the pastor, and then the bishop of the diocese would have to approve of that. But that was the idea. In other words, the right of appointment. So that is at most what the Russian legislation allowed for, that certain families could, propose certain people to be members of whatever organization there was.
So before we transition to the ecumenical nature of the organization, even from its roots here in the America, I'd like to remind listeners that you're listening to Trad Controversies on the Restoration Radio Network. I'm your host, James Trumper, and I am joined by Father Anthony Cekada of St. Gertrude the Great Church in Westchester, Ohio. Today we've been discussing the OSJ and the OSJ here in America. And I'd like to remind you that Trad Controversies is a production of the Restoration Radio Network. All rights are reserved, and any duplication without explicit written permission is forbidden. To obtain permission, please write to mail@truerestoration.org. Before we go into how traditional Catholics turned to this organization, when you were looking at its beginnings here in America, of the American OSJ, to me, and some of the quotes that you include, they sound like a Vatican II all over again, like the beginning of a Vatican II in their ecumenical nature.
Yeah, and that was something that struck me as extremely strange when I came across this literature, because the OSJ, the American OSJ, was holding itself out as a traditional organization that would appeal to traditional Catholics. Yet in their recent literature, published after Vatican II, they spoke in using the sort of terms that one would expect from some sort of an ecumenical organization, some sort of ecumenical fellowship. In effect, all members of all religions were permitted to be members of this organization, which was supposedly a Catholic religious order. And that is very strange that Protestants of different stripes, Catholics, the Orthodox schismatics of different stripes, and the small sects known as Old Catholics, that these members of these organizations were all permitted to be members, as it were, on an equal footing. So that struck me as something extremely strange, and it was something one not only discovered in the post-Vatican II material, the organization, but in the writings and in the pronouncements of those who had been involved in this organization earlier in the 20th century as well. You remember that the Russian Revolution in 1917 drove the nobility out of Russia, those that they didn't slay, and members of the different Russian noble families went into exile. Many went into exile in Paris, and some came to the United States. So you had these different Russian Grand Dukes and Duchesses floating around, and you find that they had very strange religious ideas about putting together some sort of an ecumenical one world religion with certain fundamental principles that all religions could agree on at the basis of them. And these people, of course, in turn were tied in with this interest in occultism and very odd forms of philosophy that one found at the beginning of the 20th century, the writings of Madame Blavatsky, for instance. So it was all very strange, and you see that these Russian exiles were involved in this, but these people as well were involved in the American organization known as the OSJ.
Virtually here in 1929, you have a quote from the Times from this Grand Duke Alexander, who had been the head of the OSJ here in America, this entity that's a splinter or a startup group, different from the Roman OSJ that would have been validly recognized at the time. And the quote reads, "To call into active life the religion of love, which in time will replace all existing religions, but meantime will spiritualize them and withdraw them from their present condition of gross materialism." And he goes on to say to spread great fundamental truths which are the same for all faiths and for all nations, and so to build up that universal brotherhood which Christ came into this world to establish, to bring about a conscious union of human souls with the souls of the universe, God, who is the Spirit of Supreme, and he goes on. But that sounds like Pope Francis. I mean, that's Vatican II, and that's in 1929.
Yeah, these ideas were floating around, and remember that that's about the time of the encyclical Mortalium Animos too, which condemned these ideas. So so they were very much in these universalist ideas are very much in the atmosphere, and the people like Alexander, who did have some connections with the OSJ in the United States, and who's cited in their literature, had all of these oddball ideas.
There's been a whole, looks like, host of splinterings here of the American OSJ organization in and among itself over the last 60, 70 years. And I found it interesting because in their splintering, while they consider themselves an autonomous order, not subject to the Pope, they turn to the United States federal courts to solve their different controversies.
Yes, I guess the courts on the island of Malta perhaps weren't available to them, so they had to go somewhere for it. The one figure we should mention, the dominating figure from the time of Alexander on in the 1920s, was Charles Pichel, and Pichel was he lived to a ripe old age. He was the one after Vatican II sold so many traditional Catholics on the idea that the Knights of St. John were a legitimate order. So he did his headquarters was in a place in Pennsylvania called Chickasha, Pennsylvania. And he was the man who promoted this organization. He was a married man. He had married at a certain point. How he could be the member of a religious order and be married at the same time, of course, is one of those canonical mysteries. He was the one who put together all these different documents and published all of these different claims about the continuity of this organization in the United States from the organization in Russia under Paul I. And he managed to get himself involved in the 50s and 60s with all sorts of different religious organizations, Lutherans, Presbyterians, Methodists, Old Catholics. The Old Catholics rather loved this organization because it gave them a certain amount of legitimacy. And then finally, after the Second Vatican Council, he was able to draw in a good number of Catholics who were upset with the different changes. So it was he over the period of maybe 40 years, at least 40 years or so, he was the one who kept this outfit going and caused it to be seen as a legitimate operation after the Second Vatican Council by many traditional Catholics.
And in the traditional Catholics, were accepted as members alongside of, from my understanding, reading your article, Old Catholics, Protestants, and somehow they were members of a Catholic religious order.
Yeah, this was Pichel's idea, and in fact, you would see the promotional literature. You'd see some of these common investiture ceremonies where you would have these traditional Catholics and some traditional Catholic clergy participating in the same sort of investiture ceremony with people from all these different odd religions. For some reason, the fantastic claims of Pichel and the Knights blinded so many people to the fact that underneath it was, in fact, an ecumenical organization.
And a lot of the traditional Catholic priests, it seems to me, in my time, that got hoodwinked into this organization. It sounded great. They could get their jurisdiction. They didn't have to deal with the Pope issue. Sooner or later, I think most of them uncovered the dirty laundry in the closet and subsequently left the organization. I think Father Wathen, before he died, left the organization even, and he was a huge proponent of it for many years.
Oh yes, he was one of he was definitely one of the big defenders. Father Gomer de Pau, as I said, he was really the proto-trad of proto-trad priests in the United States. He swallowed their claims, and he was a canon lawyer of all things. So they really must have talked a good line to him. But eventually, he figured them out. There were a number of priests who did research into the background of the organization, a number of who spread the word that one really could have nothing to do with it. We actually ended up with, because of the Father Wathen was a priest of Louisville, the Diocese of Louisville, which is not all that far away from here. He had a considerable influence on the trad movement in northern Kentucky and also in Cincinnati at the beginning, because he was basically the only priest who was saying the traditional Mass and criticizing the Mass of Paul VI. So we had a number of people in the area who were members actually of his organization. And eventually they got around to reading different critiques of the organization, including my own, and decided that they really could have nothing to do with it because it was so obviously fraudulent. But it was something that was at least well known for a while in the traditional movement in the United States.
I remember growing up seeing the flag of the Knights of Malta because we went to a chapel that was supported by Tom Nelson from Pan. And I remember as a child, the priest would not stand behind the pulpit. And I always thought that as odd, but it never really hit me why. I think as traditional Catholics, they tended to just, Father thinks it's okay, must be fine. Or in this case, they took Tom Nelson's opinion and ran with it. But it seems as it's slowly come to public light, people ran away from it.
Yes, and ultimately, I don't know what finally Tom Nelson's position on it was. I had dealings with Tom, very friendly dealings with Tom for a number of years after I had published my critique of the Knights of Malta, and I don't exactly recall to what extent he continued to be a member of the organization. The other interesting connection with the Knights is that Father Wathen, because of his involvement, there's also a strain of Feeneyism in the organization, because Father Wathen was very much into the teachings of Father Feeney. So that was another tangential issue tied in with the Knights. One hears next to nothing about them anymore. I'd heard that there was a priest in California maybe 2 years ago who was induced into becoming a member of their organization, a priest who I believe celebrates Mass in Garden Grove, California. and he, I think, became a part of the organization. I don't know if he still is a member of the organization, but that actually was a bone of contention and controversy among the members of his congregation, because a number of people had come across my study and Dr. Giulio Pro's study and figured out that this was not a good choice, as they would say. When last heard from, the organization was operated by a man named Dr. John Grady, who I believe lives down in Tennessee, but one does not really hear that much more about the organization. But it's an interesting topic to discuss, I think, on trad controversies, precisely because it is a part of the early history of the traditionalist movement in the United States. And, one that was tied in very intimately with this question of obedience to the diocesan hierarchy, obedience to the Pope, and the question of jurisdiction.
And I think we'll kind of wrap the show up with the OSJ's claims in relation to canon law. And one of the first things I'd like to address is their claim of being basically an autonomous order, not subject to the authority of the Pope. Has there ever been anything in Catholic history, any order that was not under the direct supervision of the Pope?
Clearly not, because the Pope is the head of the hierarchy, and a religious order, any religious order or religious congregation, is subject to the authority of the hierarchy. It's a creation of ecclesiastical law. That it's given its existence by ecclesiastical law, and the Pope is the master, as it were, of ecclesiastical law. So if you are a Catholic religious order, by that fact you are subject to the Pope.
And so then they would come back, or supporters of the order would say, well, they're only subject to faith and morals. To me, that claim would go directly against the dogmatic pronouncement of Vatican I as the Pope as the supreme head of the Church.
Well, exactly. And but also don't forget that the question of morals, the question of conduct, is when the Pope approves a religious order, he is approving or disapproving of the laws according to which its members must conduct themselves. So even there, obviously, he would have he would have a jurisdiction over what is done in a religious order. The another consideration is this, that for an order to go and to operate in a diocese where there is a bishop appointed by the Pope, there's a certain procedure that one has to observe, and this is all tightly regulated by canon law. So you couldn't say that, well, I'm a member of the Knights of Malta, and I'm just going to go and set up a public chapel in your diocese, say that to the Archbishop of Philadelphia, and there's nothing you can do about it because we're a religious order. And of course, that all of that contradicts various provisions of canon law that allow or that specify that the bishop of a diocese is the one who has the say-so about public oratories and about the access of members of the diocese to religious ceremonies by religious orders.
Because if you had all these self-started orders that didn't need the authority of Rome or fall under the authority of Rome, essentially that would legitimize chaos, because you could have a chapel here saying Mass that's not under your diocese, and the diocesan church or parish right next door.
Yeah, and all of that stuff is people who realize that it's all regulated. I mean, preaching is regulated. You can't have permission to preach to the public of the diocese unless you have the permission of the diocesan bishop. So just about everything. You can't even have a procession outdoors. The reason that an outfit like the OSJ was able to hoodwink so many people at the beginning is that people aren't familiar with these different points of church law. So you get many priests, many members of the laity who were sort of wowed by this idea that they somehow could be exempt.
And then from a canonical standpoint, a religious individual is one that's taken the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And so here you have the supposed head of the order, Charles Pichel, and I don't know about Mr. Grady, but they're married men, weren't they?
Yeah, and they hold themselves out as members of the members of this religious order, and that is something that would be impossible, and that there are rules governing what makes for the validity of one's membership in a religious order. You have to make a canonical novitiate, and there are rules that govern that regulate it in closed novitiate, and temporary vows for a certain period of time, and only then after that solemn vows. So all of this legislation gets put aside. You can't take vows as religious if you're married. It's quite forbidden, and it invalidates them because you can't keep the vow.
So I think this, kind of wrapping up the whole topic of the OSJ, is just another example of what I see out there. I would say another chapter in Catholic mythology. People out of ignorance, out of desperation, kind of made things up in the late 60s, 70s, instead of going to the books in their desperation to justify what they were doing. And what they were doing was good in the standpoint of holding to tradition, but their means of justification or their justification for it was incorrect.
Yes, indeed, and a lot of these people were snookered. I mean, who knows about the ins and outs of canon law? And I mean, if I have to go digging through several libraries and end up in an attic at Catholic University to figure out all this nonsense about Paul the First, there are a number of obstacles that you have to overcome. But if you're a common sense person on the face of it, it doesn't sound right that somehow there would be a way for you to be completely exempt from the authority of the diocesan bishop. But again, it was a way of grasping at straws that people had to resolve the authority and to resolve the Pope issue. That what was being commanded was done by the Pope, and it was obviously bad. Well, we're not subject to his authority, and this organization allows us to be not subject to his authority. But that, of course, is that's a myth, and one that never can be sufficiently denounced. It's understandable at the beginning of the traditionalist movement that people would grasp at straws like this, but in the long term, it's not. It's impossible to reconcile that with Catholic theology and canon law.
Well, Father, as a young person in tradition, or as a traditional Catholic, I can say from my personal standpoint, I really appreciate your invaluable research bringing this topic to light and dispelling all these shrouds that were laying over the top of it. And I appreciate your hard work, and hopefully with this show, and I definitely would refer people to your article titled History, Canon Law, and the Order of St. John, which you can find at traditionalmass.org, which gives a complete overview of the topic, and I highly suggest reading it. That with this show and reading that article, hopefully people won't be snookered in this organization or other organizations that may arise similar to it. So as we close out this episode, we've really discussed the OSJ, the history of it, some of the interesting points of the topic. And I want to thank Father Cekada for his time and just ask, is there anything you'd like to summarize or add to the topic before we close?
No, but I think it's simply this, that you have to remember as a traditional Catholic that one principle is that the unknown often passes for the marvelous, and in fact that's a quotation from the Roman writer Tacitus that I quote at the beginning of my article on the OSJ. The unknown often passes for the marvelous, and that if something seems too good to be true, chances are it's not true. And we find that again and again, unfortunately, in this situation in the post-Vatican II Church. So, and it is research in history and theology and canon law that will enlighten us as to what the practice and the teaching of the Church is on so many of these different matters.
And that really ties back to how we started the show with 132 footnotes. Readers can go to your article and see the source material. They can check it out for themselves. So often I've found these pamphlets floating around of people supporting OSJ or other topics, and they have no footnotes. They have no quotations. There's no source material. And to me, that if there's no footnotes, there's no witnesses, no authorities they're turning to for answers, they're probably not legitimate writers. Father, thanks again for joining us for this month's show, and we look forward and hope to talk to you soon.
All right, God bless you, and have a good continuation of your summer, all of you.
God bless. Take care, Father.
Bye now.
If you have any questions for Father Cekada or feedback on this episode, we would love to hear from you. You can contact us at controversies@truerestoration.org, and we will pass along your questions or comments to Father Cekada. We would like to take this moment to remind you that all correspondence with us is strictly confidential. All of us here at the Restoration Radio Network would ask if you found the show to be informative, helpful, or in any way beneficial to you and your faith, that you would please consider sending a note of thanks to the clergy who help make our network worthwhile. Remember that above and beyond material contributions, the most important donation you can make to our work here is prayer. Please think of offering a Mass, a Rosary, or even a simple Ave for our work the next time you pray. For the Restoration, I'm James Shrepfer. May God bless you.
This program was brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org. That's novusordowatch.org.